Hello and good morning to each and every one of you out there. I hope you're feeling as good as I am today. I finally went back to the coffee shop to put today's story together this morning, or yesterday morning, as I've been solely writing at home for the past few months, and it just felt so nice to be back. There's something special about sipping a coffee made just for you and people watching to accompany me and my day. Also, I know y'all can't see me, but I'm trying out a ring. I've never worn any jewelry before, but my friend bought me this ring, and honestly, I'm kind of digging it. I probably don't look any different, but I do enjoy the clinking sound it makes on glasses. I'm probably really annoying. Anywho, shall we? And yes, we have another wonderfully vintage case today. Today I bring you the Cordelia Botkin case. My name is Eli, and this is Murder in the Morning. My sources today come from the Historical Crime Detective site that I have been talking about nonstop for the past 2 weeks, and a New York Post article as well. On February 12th, 1891, John Dunning married Miss Mary Pennington in Dover, Delaware, and the couple decided to move to San Francisco to start a family. 1 year later, the two welcomed a little girl into the world and moved into a slightly larger home on 2529 California Street, near the Golden Gate Bridge. One day, while Mary tended to their daughter, John took a stroll through the Golden Gate Park and happened to cross paths with a woman. The two conversed and eventually flirted, and the woman told John that her husband, W.A. Botkin, was away in England. Her name was Cordelia Botkin, originally from the Midwest, and according to the detective site, she lived in Stockton, California with their husband, who she married back in 1872, and they had lived with a grown son named Beverly. After this initial meeting, things only intensified between the two. While Cordelia's husband was working and John Dunning's wife watched the newborn, they continuously met in secret. As he cheated and time went on, his wife, Mary Pennington, felt homesick and decided to move back to Delaware where her family resided. It's not explicitly stated, but I don't believe she knew of her husband's clandestine activities at the time. After she moved home, the two lovers spent nearly every day together. Quote, Mrs. Botkin moved to 927 Geary Street, and Dunning took a room in the same building. In the course of conversation one evening, he told Mrs. Botkin that his wife, Mary, was passionately fond of candy and that she had a very dear friend in San Francisco named Mrs. Corbally. This will become very important later. Remember that name. More years passed, and on March 8th of 1898, John Dunning accepted a new position as a war correspondent with the Associated Press, which made it necessary for him to depart immediately for Puerto Rico. When he told Mrs. Botkin about his plans, she pleaded with him to remain with her and stay in California. He turned a deaf ear to her pleadings and told her bluntly that he would never return to San Francisco, end quote. My guess is that after his stint off the mainland, he possibly planned to move back with his wife in Delaware. But then again, he's a real shit husband, so who really knows? So John moved, Cordelia wept, and life went on. Months passed, and it appeared as if their story had ended. But then on August 9th of 1898, a small package arrived in Dover, Delaware, addressed to Mrs. John P. Dunning, which would be Mary. That package then arrived at the Pennington household. Mary Pennington's family consisted of her parents, Mr. and Mrs. Pennington, their two daughters, Mrs. Dunning, and Mrs. Joshua Dean, their son-in-law, Mr. Dean, and the two little children of Mr. and Mrs. Dean. I'm sorry that's really confusing because all the wives went by just Mrs. and the husband's name, but there was a total of 7 people living in that household. Quote, "After supper, the family retired to the porch, and Mrs. Dunning opened the package. It proved to be a fancy candy box containing a handkerchief, chocolate creams, and a small slip of paper on which were the following words. Quote, 'With love to yourself and baby, from Mrs. C.' End quote. Mrs. Dunning could not imagine who had sent the package, but being a noble and respected woman with friends galore, she did not suspect that she had an enemy in the world, and therefore her suspicion was never aroused. Mrs. Dunning and Mrs. Dean and the 2 children partook of the candy, as did also 2 young ladies, Miss Millington and Miss Bateman, who happened by chance to pass the Pennington residence while the family were seated on their porch. During the night, all who partook of the candy were taken with retching pains in the stomach and vomited freely." End quote. All but 2 people recovered. Within 3 days, on August 12th, both Mrs. Dean and Mrs. Dunning had passed away. Autopsies disclosed the fact that these ladies had died from arsenic poisoning. Dr. Wood, a chemist, examined the candy which had not been eaten and discovered a large amount of arsenic present. John Dunning, now widowed, received the news and proceeded to Delaware as fast as he could. Quote, "He immediately recognized the handwriting as that of Mrs. Botkin and recalled his remark to her regarding his wife's fondness for candy, and also that his wife had a friend in San Francisco named Mrs. Cordelia, which accounted for the C initial to the note. Detective B.J. McVeigh was sent to San Francisco with the candy, handkerchief, candy box, and the note in the box. Chief of Police I.W. Lees took charge of the case, and Miss Botkin was located in Stockton, California, where she was living with her husband and son. The detectives brought her to San Francisco, and in a few days, an overwhelming amount of circumstantial evidence was piled up against her." End quote. Overwhelming may be an understatement. This lady left a literal trail of breadcrumbs everywhere she went. According to Jason Morrow, she was positively identified by Miss Sylvia Heaney and Miss Kitty Dittmer as the woman who, on July 31st, bought candy in the candy store of George Haas under the Felon Block on Market Street. Miss Heaney, furthermore, swore that this woman requested that the candy be placed in a fancy box which did not have the firm's name on it, and also instructed that the box not be filled completely, as she had another article to place in the box. John P. Dunning, in the investigation, produced countless love letters written to him from Mrs. Botkin, and a handwriting expert, Theodore Kitka, testified that the person who wrote the love letters also wrote the address on the candy box and the note. Mrs. Botkin even neglected to remove the store tag from the handkerchief that she purchased in the City of Paris store from Mrs. Grace Harris, who even recalled the conversation she held with Mrs. Botkin. When asked why she recalled it so clearly, she stated that Mrs. Botkin's resemblance to her dead mother had startled her. Subsequently, she produced a photograph of her mother to show a striking resemblance. Frank Gray, a druggist employed at the Owl drugstore, positively identified Mrs. Botkin as the woman who had purchased 2 ounces of arsenic for the alleged purpose of bleaching a straw hat. And she insisted upon getting this drug even when the druggist informed her that there were many other preparations better adapted for that purpose. On August 4th, the package of candy was mailed at the Ferry Post Office and was particularly noticed by a postal clerk named John Dunnigan because the address Mrs. John Dunning reminded him of his own name. On that same day, August 4th, Mrs. Botkin left San Francisco for St. Helena. After Mrs. Botkin left the Hotel Victoria at Hyde and California Streets, where she had been staying for months, a hotel clerk found a torn piece of a paper seal, similar to those pasted on candy boxes, on the floor of room 26, which Mrs. Botkin had vacated. It was soon proved that the seal came from the same George Haas candy store, and the wrapping on the candy box clearly showed where it had been removed. Again, everywhere she went, people remembered her. It's almost as dumb as signing the actual poison book before killing someone with the said poison, as I've mentioned in a previous story. And so, Cordelia Botkin was arrested in California, where she was set to stand trial. And on December 9th of 1898, the trial for the murder of Mrs. Dunning began. Over the next 20 days, the prosecution laid out everything I previously mentioned, and of course, brought John Dunning to the stand. Quote, on December 19th, while testifying in the case, John P. Dunning refused to mention the names of any other women he had been intimate with, and he was adjudged guilty of contempt and sent to jail, where he remained for several days until the question was withdrawn. On December 30th, 1898, Mrs. Botkin was found guilty, and on February 4th, 1899, she was sentenced to life in prison. End quote. Within a month of her conviction, her husband, W.A. Botkin, sued her for a divorce on the grounds that she had been convicted of a felony. And after the conviction, Mrs. Botkin was confined in the Branch County Jail, where allegedly she made quite a comfortable life for herself. The, quote, voluptuous woman was on intimate terms with one or more of the guards, which accounted for the fact that she was surrounded with every comfort at the jail, end quote. Thankfully, and I promise this is the only time I'll ever utter this sentence, the jail became overcrowded and Cordelia lost most of her extra amenities, resulting in her odd request for a transfer to San Quentin, of all places. And that request was complied with on May 16th of 1906. According to Morrow, the prisoner became a victim of nervous prostration and was soon a physical wreck. During the latter part of 1909, she began to suffer from melancholy, and in February of 1910, she applied for parole because of her poor health, but it was decided that she was not eligible. On March 7th of 1910, she fell unconscious and died. Her death certificate shows that she died from, quote, softening of the brain due to melancholy. She was 56 years old. What the heck is death by melancholy? I feel like I should... Oh, never mind. Just Googled it. Should have known. I just thought it was a hill somewhere. And that, my friends, is the case of Cordelia Botkin. A bit shorter today, but as always, I hope you found some enjoyment along the way. Stick around for a bonus story after the music if you'd like. And with that, I bid you adieu. Okie dokie. Bye-bye. Love you. Oh, this is a good one today. Good one today. I don't really know how to introduce this story, but just listen to this title and tell me you don't want to go to Poland. Titled, Catholic Priest Who Threw Wild Orgy Where Male Hooker OD'd on ED Pills Learns His Fate. From the New York Post. A Catholic priest who hosted an out-of-control orgy where a male sex worker overdosed on ED pills and was mutilated was sentenced to 18 months in prison in Poland on Tuesday. The Polish clergyman, who was assigned to the Church of the Blessed Virgin Mary of the Angels, landed jail time after being convicted of sexual offenses, supplying drugs, and failing to provide assistance to a person in danger of loss of life or serious bodily harm. He was only officially identified as, quote, Thomas Z because of Polish privacy laws, but the Daily Mail said that he was Father Tomasz Zmarzli. Zmarzli organized a sex party gone awry at his parish-owned apartment in Dąbrowa Górnicza near the Czech Republic-Poland border in August of 2023. The unnamed male sex worker collapsed at the bash after taking too many ED pills, and the priest then threw one of his buddies out of the home when he wanted to call the police. The attendee called emergency services anyways outside the house, while his unconscious friend remained inside. When paramedics arrived, the priest refused to allow them inside. That's so anti-God. Oh my gosh. Ugh. So the paramedics called the cops, and after gaining entrance to the home, authorities found the unconscious sex worker lying on a bed with his lower body severely mutilated. He was taken to a hospital where he thankfully later signed himself out. After the incident gained traction in the media, Zmarzli told Wyborska that the case was only popular because it involved a member of the clergy. Quote, if something similar happened to a little-known person with a different profession, not media or clergy, there would be no issue at all. He was stripped of all church duties, including being an assistant to a youth program and head of the Catholic newspaper Niedziela Snasgwika in late September. Zmarzli was arrested in January and charged with 4 offenses. The Diocese of Sosnowiec had been engulfed in scandal since the news broke, causing Zmarzli to be discharged from the clergy and Bishop Gregorz Kazak to step down. Pope Francis accepted Kazak's resignation, and Archbishop Adrian Galbus of Katowice, a city nearby, was appointed as administrator of the Snaswiec Diocese. In addition to his jail time, Zmarzli was ordered to pay the victim $3,800 and set up and donate to a fund to help victims of crime. End quote. My goodness. Zmarzli, would Jesus approve of you throwing that sex party? But seriously, what an epic story. Sadly, that is all I have for you today, folks. Actually, psych, I might make this a double header. Double feature, double header. That's like softball. I don't know, this episode and the episode I was going to... Anyways, they're both kind of short, and I might put them together and just see how it works. See if y'all like it. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed that story, and I will see you either in a week or in like 30 seconds if I double this up. Okie dokie. Bye-bye. Love you. Hello and good morning. How are we all doing today? Ooh, what do you guys think? Did OJ go up or down? Down, baby. So yeah, Broncos are cool again. Woo! Honestly, let's just get straight into it today. I have nothing else to talk about, and we have a perplexing crime scene to uncover. Today, I bring you the murder of Nora Kelly. My name is Eli, and this is Murder in the Morning. My sources for today again come from explicitly one website, historicalcrimedetective.com. Absolutely love that place. Shout out to Jason Lucky Morrow, I think is his full name. Jason Morrow, for having an endless supply of stories that I can share with you all. Our story takes place in the 1930s Brooklyn. Like every city of that era, they too had been pummeled by the Great Depression. According to all chronology, the economic challenges of the 1930s left a mark on the families of Brooklyn. Many households grappled with unemployment, poverty, and the daily struggle to make ends meet. However, the cityscape was a canvas for games like stickball or stoopball, providing a backdrop for the development of lifelong friendships and the forging of strong community ties. The iconic Coney Island, situated in Brooklyn, offered a recreational haven, so to speak, with its boardwalk, amusement rides, sandy beaches, and it provided an escape from the harsh realities of that era. Family life in Brooklyn was characterized by its close-knit nature. Multi-generational households were common, and extended families often lived within the same neighborhoods. Which leads us very nicely into our story. At 4 a.m. on April 1st, 1935, Brooklyn subway conductor Patrick Murray arrived home after finishing another shift. As he made his way to the second floor of this dwelling on Marine Avenue, he noticed something peculiar. The hallway light had not yet been extinguished. Quote, "It is customary in most homes to leave a light burning at night when someone is still out, but Murray's landlady, 68-year-old Nora Kelly, who lived on the ground floor with her dog Brownie, had to count every penny. She had no source of income other than the $30 a month she received as rent from the Murray family, so she always turned out the hall light when she retired for the night. Murray, long time a night worker, accustomed to finding his way around in the dark, was surprised, end quote. Noting this, Patrick continued upstairs where he resided with his wife Helen and their 4-year-old daughter, Eleanor. As he undressed and prepared for bed, Murray noticed another unusual circumstance. Mrs. Kelly's dog Brownie could be heard howling in the backyard. According to the historical crime detective site, this puzzled the conductor much more than the light. He knew it was the landlady's habit every night at 10 o'clock to unleash Brownie from his kennel in the yard and take him into the cellar. Murray decided that Mrs. Kelly had gone visiting and maybe failed to come home. That would explain both the light being on and the fact that the dog had not been taken in for the night. Surely if she were home, she would long since have heard Brownie's barking. After a few more ear-piercing howls, Murray grabbed a flashlight and went to take the dog inside himself. Quote, Murray noticed that the 7-foot length of rope which leashed Brownie had become frayed from his incessant leaping efforts to get loose. He was quivering and panting with impatience as Murray untied him. This, too, struck the man as very unusual, for the dog neither showed relief nor gratitude, but only a desperate urgency, as though he were needed somewhere, and he must get there, end quote. Heading towards the cellar, Murray tried to calm the agitated dog to no avail, straining against the leash until they reached the doors. Patrick opened the doors and tried to keep up as Brownie sprinted down the steps. Murray once again tried to calm down the dog, but was cut short as the beam of his flashlight shimmered across the limp, black-clad figure of Miss Nora Kelly, hanging from the rafters. Brownie whined at her feet as Patrick tried to comprehend what he was seeing. He inched closer and noticed that Kelly was strung up by just a few feet of insulated telephone wire. With his stomach upside down, he turned on his heel towards the stairs and headed up to alert the authorities. Why would Miss Kelly have done such a thing, he thought to himself. Within an hour, 2 patrolmen and 2 detectives arrived to see Murray waiting outside the house, where he directed them to the basement cellar. There was no reason for Miss Kelly to hang herself, Patrick told the officers. She had been in good spirits, no trouble that he knew of, and she lived near her very loving granddaughter whom she cherished and saw nearly every day. As for the scene itself, the officers noted some odd dust marks just underneath her on the floor, which they couldn't decipher. They also came across her fake teeth at least 12 feet away from her body. The officers thought that maybe the force of the plunge had knocked them from her mouth. But besides that, they were certain she had done this to herself. According to Jason Morrow, the excitement had awakened Mrs. Murray, their 4-year-old daughter, and their police dog. There was no sound from Mrs. Kelly's apartment, so the Murrays assumed that Miss Kelly's granddaughter, 18-year-old Florence McVeigh, the one I just previously mentioned, had returned to her place of employment after spending her Sunday evening off with Miss Kelly. The granddaughter Florence worked for Mr. and Mrs. Joseph Armstrong, whose home on Fort Hamilton Parkway was within walking distance of the house on Marine Avenue. Mrs. Murray headed towards the commotion, and as Patrick explained the situation to his wife, the investigators continued their search inside the house, just in case the cellar wasn't the end of it. They found no evidence of disorder, break-ins, or even robbery, and were just about to wrap it up until one of the officers shrieked. It was another body. 18-year-old Florence McVeigh. Quote, she was on her back, her head tilted to one side, eyes fixated on the ceiling. She was fully dressed except for her shoes, which were neatly placed underneath the sofa she was lying by. The body was in a brown skirt, silk stockings, and a gray V-necked sweater. Her clothes were neatly arranged, and an examination showed the body was free from bruises or marks. It seemed as though she had died while sleeping on the floor. A hasty medical examination indicated that both deaths had occurred early in the previous evening, between 8 and 9 o'clock. Mrs. Murray, who had been home all evening, said she had heard no sounds whatsoever, nor had her dog, a very alert police dog. Miss Kelly's body was removed to the Fort Hamilton police station, and the girl's body was taken to the Kings County morgue. Except for the somewhat puzzling circumstance of the dust trail in the cellar and the fact that there was no money in the house, the police were fairly satisfied that Florence McVeigh had died a natural death and that Miss Kelly had hanged herself. To them, it was difficult to determine which of the two had died first. If the girl had died first, then it was possible that her devoted grandmother had killed herself in an overwhelming fit. It was also possible that Mrs. Kelly, for some inexplicable reason, had taken her life and that the girl had died of shock soon after discovering the body. End quote. How can you justify that as an investigator? All this assumption just hurts my brain. I mean, quoted as saying they were fairly satisfied. It didn't matter who died first, they just thought they both died because they died. The detectives were happy with this natural death suicide theory, but thankfully, someone else wasn't. 8 hours later, around noon, remember this basically all happened before sunup, Dr. Emmanuel E. Martin, the deputy medical examiner, telephoned the DA's office and reported that Florence McVeigh had been criminally assaulted. In that time, criminally assaulted was code for sexually assaulted or raped. He stated positively, she did not die a natural death. I believe she was smothered. According to the crime detective site, this piece of news threw the police into a state of feverish activity. As swarms of detectives poured back into the neighborhood of the crime, the body of Mrs. Kelly was rushed to the morgue, where Dr. George W. Ruger made an examination, which should have been done previously, and he reported that she too had been assaulted. Plus, her chest had been crushed in, and she had been dead way before the noose was ever placed around her neck. The officers literally missed everything during their initial investigation of the crime scene. Shame on them. Again, assumptions kill, or don't catch killers. Quote, investigators immediately recalled the recent mysterious death of Victoria Muspratt, 70-year-old spinster and recluse, who on December 22nd of 1934 was beaten to death in her dingy home at Shore Road and 71st Street, only a mile and a half away from the Marine Avenue house. However, there was great dissimilarity between the two cases. Miss Muspratt had been long suspected of being a miser with hidden riches, and robbery might well have been the motive. Also, Miss Muspratt had been known in the neighborhood as a crotchety old lady, while Mrs. Kelly was enjoyed and admired by the neighbors, shopkeepers, and the children of the community in which she had lived for many years. End quote. So, an entirely new investigation began, this time with murder on the mind. Police rounded up as many family members as they could for questioning. But they all said the same thing. Mrs. Kelly was kind and old. Not much to it, and they couldn't understand why anyone would do either of these women harm. Quote, solution of the mystery seemed difficult indeed at this stage of the investigation. The perpetrator of the now double murder had left no clues at the scene. Very likely he had remained in the apartment long enough to wipe out any possible evidence he may have left behind, end quote. Their first break in the case wouldn't come from a family member, but rather a friendly neighbor. Eleanor Myers, who had been Mrs. Kelly's long-term friend, went to the police with what she thought might be helpful information. The night prior, before any news of the murders broke, Mrs. Myers had gone to see Kelly at her home just before 9 p.m. She told police, I rang the bell, but there was no answer, so I rang again. I was just about to go away, figuring she wasn't home, although I expected that she would be, when the door opened up. The man who answered was Tom McFarland, Mrs. Kelly's son-in-law. The officers asked Eleanor if she was sure that it was the son-in-law, and she responded, oh yes, he used to live with Mrs. Kelly, he and the 3 children. His wife died when the twins were born, and Mrs. Kelly raised all of the children, end quote. The police continue, what happened after he said Mrs. Kelly wasn't home? Eleanor responds, nothing, I just said I was sorry I'd missed her, and I went away. I didn't think anything more about it until I heard what happened. The police knew of Tom, but hadn't had a chance to question him yet, as they did with the rest of the family. According to the crime detective site, Tom McFarland had met Miss Kelly's daughter, Anna, while serving in the Army at Fort Hancock. They had been married the same year in St. Patrick's Church in Bay Ridge. Their first child, Marion, was born in 1921, and 3 years later, twins, Anna and Edith. Anna Kelly, the mother, had died when the twins were born, and the family had gone to live with the grandmother, Mrs. Kelly. This new information was perplexing to the investigators. Were the two women already dead when he answered the door, or was this another false lead? Quote, McFarland was taken into custody at 5 p.m. for questioning, 13 hours after the discovery of Mrs. Kelly's body. A good-looking man at 39 years old, dressed in a gray suit, soft gray hat, and a blue overcoat. He looked quite dapper. When he was taken into the presence of officials including D.A. Gogan and Deputy Chief Inspector John Ryan, it was difficult to believe that he could be the man guilty of such a horrific crime. But there were blood spots on his suit and fear in his eyes. For nearly 5 hours, he told the police that he knew nothing. But as they pressed on, he weakened. I don't know what they said to him to finally give it all up, but at 10:05 p.m., he broke down and told the following story. He had left his home at 2 o'clock Sunday afternoon after dining with his daughters. He had a glass of beer and some sherry during dinner, and on the way to the house on Marine Avenue, he stopped at a saloon, although he claims he hadn't intended to do any more drinking. He consumed 5 more glasses of beer at the saloon and also bought a bottle of sherry. Then he took the 4th Avenue BMT subway to 95th Street and walked the remaining few blocks to Mrs. Kelly's house. He insisted time and again that he went there with no malice in his heart, that it had been nothing more than a friendly visit. He arrived about dusk. The apartments on both floors of the house were illuminated. He was admitted by Mrs. Kelly and saw that Florence McVeigh was there too. He accompanied Mrs. Kelly into the kitchen, where he opened the bottle of sherry and began drinking. He continued taking drinks straight from the bottle, and finally at about 8 o'clock, Mrs. Kelly told him to stop because he was making a pig of himself. Kelly, who had refused to drink with him, said he would have to leave. According to his confession, quote, she raised a chair as though to frighten me with it, and then everything went black before me, and I think I choked her. Florence, attracted by all the commotion, came to the kitchen door and saw her grandmother unconscious. She exclaimed, "What have you done?" Tom McFarland, frightened because she knew what had happened, seized her and choked her as well. According to his story, he was afraid that she would grab a knife or something nearby on the kitchen table, but he did admit that he had done away with Miss McVeigh because she had been a witness. Again, he insisted he did not remember assaulting either of his victims, but he could not deny it. According to him, he just couldn't remember because everything was blank. But you remember answering the bell when Miss Myers called, the DA asked. Yes, I shouldn't have gone to the door. That was a mistake. It was indeed, agreed the DA. McFarland was then officially arrested and would stand trial for 2 counts of murder the following January. I hate that excuse, like, I blacked out, but I remember the moment in between I killed 2 people, but I blacked out again, and now I only remember bits and pieces. His defense tried to argue that he was shell-shocked or traumatized from the war and would often forget parts of his day. They didn't argue his involvement, but hoped for a more lenient sentence. The only other one to take the stand in his defense was his daughter, Marion. Alas, the jury stood with the prosecution and found Tom McFarland guilty of murder in the 1st degree, and he was to be put to death in August. His daughter wept and begged for mercy. The jury cried too, but at Marion's emotions, not for Tom. His life would come to an end in the electric chair on August 20th, 1936, at Sing Sing Prison in New York. And that, my friends, is the murder of Mrs. Nora Kelly and Florence McVeigh. I hope you all enjoyed the story. I did have a lot of fun putting it together. Of course, I couldn't have done any of it without Jason Morrow of my new favorite website. Thank you all again for taking the time out of your day to listen in. It is appreciated much more than you know. And if you'd like, stick around for just a little bonus bit after the music. Okie dokie. Bye-bye. Love you. Hey. Today we have just a brief update on the Doomsday Daddy Chatty Daybell trial if you haven't been following along. Nothing crazy yet, as most of the evidence is essentially known already, but now we know the route the defense will be taking. And this comes from a Rolling Stone article by Miles Klee. Daybell's trial began Wednesday in a Boise courtroom presided over by Judge Stephen Boyce, who also served as the judge in Lori Vallow's trial. In an opening statement broken down into chapters, prosecutor Rob Wood explained how the remains of Vallow's 2 children had been found buried on the Daybell's property in Rexburg, Idaho, and he gave a timeline of the dizzying events that led to this grim discovery. Rob Wood told the jury on Wednesday that during the state's lengthy case against Chad Daybell, they would hear many of the defendant's own words and multiple text messages that he and Vallow sent back and forth, seeming to imply that Daybell's communications would confirm his guilt. But Daybell's defense attorney, John Pryor, sought in his opening statement to paint him as a man in thrall to an attractive, voracious, and, quote, very sexual woman, almost helpless but to carry out her bidding. I mean, come on. Pryor said of the couple's first meeting at the religious convention that this beautifully stunning woman named Lori Vallow comes up and she starts giving him a lot of attention. She pursued him, she encouraged him, she went so far as to go behind the booth and help him sell his books. Pryor also described Vallow's first few marriages as short-lived and stormy, in contrast to Daybell's relatively stable family life. He further claimed that there was no DNA evidence from Daybell on JJ or Tylee, the 2 children. As for the death of Tammy, he said the jury would learn that she used natural remedies for a number of health issues and, quote, would refuse to see a doctor. Reporter Leah Sottle, whose book, When the Moon Turns to Blood, details how Daybell and Vallow fell into a twisted belief system of their own making. Leah tweeted that Pryor's strategy of deflecting blame to the already convicted and sentenced Vallow was, quote, misogynistic and an attempt to convince members of the jury that Daybell had been, quote, overtaken by a Jezebel figure like Vallow, a woman of failed marriages and irresistible sexuality, end quote. She also noted the irony of this alongside the defense's argument that Tammy was primarily responsible for her husband's publishing business. Quote, a man from a very patriarchal faith saying the woman around him controlled him, end quote. But the prosecution will likely argue that Vallow was entranced by Daybell's talk of their prominent roles in some kind of hidden holy war, and it will take serious work to convince a jury that the influence primarily flowed the other way. Vallow's defense team tried to cast Daybell as the criminal mastermind of the couple. It didn't prevent her conviction, and if this turns out to be nothing more than the mirror version of that trial, Daybell's chances of avoiding death row may be thin, end quote. And there you have it, folks, a classic blame game. A little he said, she said. I wouldn't expect anything less from child murderers. But that is all I have for you today. Thank you all once again, and I will see you on Thursday. Okie dokie. Bye-bye. Love you.